my friend of 50 years, but you'll never know it by the question she's going to ask me.
In the third quarter of last year, you spent almost $1 billion buying Berkshire B stock at an average price of $207. But then you got to a period between December 26th and April 11th when the stock languished for almost 4 months under 207, and yet you purchased what I think of as a very limited amount of stock, even as you were sitting on an enormous pile of $112 billion. My question is why you did not repurchase a lot more stock, unless, of course, there was for a time an acquisition of, say, $80 billion to $90 billion on your radar.
Yeah, the question, whether we had 100 billion or 200 billion would not make a difference, or 50 billion would not make a difference in our approach to repurchase of shares. We repurchase shares. We used to have a policy of tying it to book value, but that really became obsolete. It did not. The real thing is to buy stock, repurchase shares only when you think you're doing it at a price where the remaining shareholders are worth more the moment after you repurchased it than they were the moment before. It's very much like if you were running a partnership and you had 3 partners in it and the business was worth $3 million, and one of the partners came and said, I'd like you to buy back my share of the partnership for $1 billion. I started out with millions, I'll stay with millions, for 1.1 million, and we'd say forget it. And if he said 1 million, we'd probably say forget it, and if he said 900,000, we'd take it, because at that point the remaining business would be worth 2 million one, and we'd have 2 owners, and our interest in value would have gone from $1 million to $1,050,000. So it's very simple arithmetic. Most companies adopt repurchase programs and they just say we're going to spend so much. That's like saying we're going to buy XYZ stock and we're going to spend so much, or we're going to buy a company and we're going to spend whatever it takes. We will buy stock when we think it is selling below a conservative estimate of its intrinsic value. Now, the intrinsic value is not a specific point. It's probably a range in my mind that might have a band maybe of 10%. Charlie would have a band in his mind, and it would probably be 10%. And ours would not be identical, but they'd be very close. And sometimes he might figure a bit higher than I do, a bit lower. But we want to be sure when we repurchase shares that those people who have not sold shares are better off than they were before we repurchased them. And it's very simple. And in the first quarter of the year, they'll find we bought something over $1 billion worth of stock. And that's nothing like my ambitions. But what that means is that we feel that we're okay buying it, but we don't salivate over buying it. We think that the shares we repurchased in the first quarter leave the shareholders better off than if we hadn't, the remaining shareholders better off than if we hadn't bought it. But we don't think the difference is dramatic. And you could easily see periods where we would spend very substantial sums if we thought the stock was selling at, say, 25 or 30% less than it was worth, and we didn't have something else that was even better. But we have no ambition in any given quarter to spend a dime unless we think you're going to be better off for us having done so. Charlie?
Well, I predict that we'll get a little more liberal in repurchasing shares.
I was going to give you equal time, but then... Okay, John Brandt.
Do you and current BNSF management believe that it's now a good idea for BNSF to adopt precision railroading playbook, or do you agree with its critics?
Precision railroading, as it's labeled, was probably invented by a fellow named Hunter Harrison. I think maybe he was at the Illinois Central Railroad at the time. There's a book that came out about Hunter, who died maybe a year ago or thereabouts, and it describes his procedure toward railroading. It's an interesting read if you're interested in railroading. And he took that to Canadian National, CN. There's 6 big railroads in North America, and he took that to CN, and he was very successful. And actually, Bill Gates is probably the largest holder of CN. So, and I think he's done very well with that stock. And then later, Canadian Pacific was the subject of an activist, and when as they proceeded, they got Hunter to join them and brought in an associate, Keith Creel, and they instituted a somewhat similar program. Now the same thing has happened at CSX, and all of those companies dramatically improved their profit margins, and they had varying degrees of difficulty with customer service in the implementing of it. But I would say that we watch very carefully. The Union Pacific is doing a somewhat modified version, but we are not above copying anything that is successful, and I think that there's been a good deal that's been learned by watching these 4 railroads, and we will, if we think we can serve our customers well and get more efficient in the process, we will adopt whatever we observe. But we don't have to do it today or tomorrow. But we do have to find something that gets at least equal and hopefully better customer satisfaction, and that makes our railroad more efficient. And there's been growing evidence that from the actions of these other 4 railroads, there's been growing evidence that we can learn something from what they do. Charlie?
Well, I doubt that anybody is very interested in unprecision in railroading.
Well, Johnny, has Charlie answered your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Station number 1 from the shareholder group up on my far right.
Good morning. My name is Bill Moyer, and I'm from Vashon Island, Washington. Interestingly, only 3.5% of the value of freight in the U.S. moves on trains. Berkshire Hathaway is incredibly well positioned with its investments in the Northern and Southern Transcon through BNSF to grab far more of that freight traffic off of the roads and get diesel out of our communities, as well as harness transmission corridors for your Berkshire renewable energy assets.
We've examined a lot of things in terms of LNG. I mean, obviously we want to become more energy efficient as well as just generally efficient. And I'm not sure about the value of freight. You mentioned 3.5%. I believe, I mean, I'm not sure what figure you're using as the denominator there, because if you look at the movement of traffic by ton miles, rails are around 40% of the U.S. We're not talking local deliveries or all kinds of things like of that, but they're 40%. roughly by rail. And BNSF moves more ton miles than any other entity. We move 15% plus of all the 10 miles moved in the United States. But if you take trucking, for example, on intermodal freight, we're extremely competitive on the longer hauls, but the shorter the haul, the more likely it is that the flexibility of freight, where a truck can go any place, and we have rails. So the equation changes depending on distance hauled and other factors, but distance hauled is a huge factor. We can move a ton mile with 500. We can move 500 plus ton miles of freight for 1 gallon of diesel, and that is far more efficient than trucks. So the long haul traffic and the heavy traffic is going to go to the rails, and we try to improve our part of the equation on that all the time. But if you're going to transport something 10 or 20 or 30 miles between a shipper and a receiver, and you're not going to move that by rail. So we look at things all the time. I can assure you, Carl Ice is well, he's probably here now, and he'll be in the other room. And he's running the railroad. You're free to talk to him, but I don't see any breakthrough like you're talking about. I do see us getting more efficient year by year by year, and obviously if trucks, driverless trucks become part of the equation, that moves things toward trucking. But on long haul heavy stuff, and there's a lot of it, you're looking at the railroad that carries more than any other mode of transportation, and BNSF is the leader. Charlie?
Well, over the long term, our questioner is on the side of the angels. Sooner or later, we'll have it more electrified. I think Greg will decide when it happens.
Yeah. But we're all working on the technology, but and we're considerably more efficient than 10, 20, 30 years ago, if you look at the numbers. But one interesting figure, I think right after World War II, when the country probably had about 140 million people against our 330 million now, so we had 40% of the population. We had over 1.5 million people employed in the railroad industry. Now there's less than 200,000, and we're carrying a whole lot more freight. Now there's some change in passengers, but the efficiency of the railroads compared to, and the safety compared to what it was even immediately after World War II, has improved dramatically. Charlie, anything more?
No.
Okay, Becky?